So I want to talk a little bit about the importance of having a good mind to muscle connection for piano technique, and kind of how to develop that a little bit, but mainly the importance of it. So this is a concept that I've actually never heard anyone else really talk about, at least in terms of mind-muscle connection. I think that some things that people talk about in terms of technique imply that, but like finger independence, right? Well, independence is controlled by our brain. So obviously there's a certain amount of mind-muscle connection, but let's think about this a little bit more closely. So mind-muscle connection is basically this idea that you want to be able to recruit a specific muscle. So this idea is very common in weightlifting. And the idea is that, for instance, normally when you're doing certain kind of lifts, you're trying to isolate a particular muscle. Or maybe you're not exactly isolating, you're using specific muscles, but you can target certain muscle groups more than others. So think about it like a pull-up, okay? So you go to the pull-up bar and you pull it up like this, okay? Overhand grip, right? And a lot of times what happens is people will be using more of they're trying to do it with all of their arms and their shoulders. Well, really it's a back exercise. It will exercise your arms and shoulders, obviously, to a degree, but it's really, focusing on your lats, on your back, so your upper back muscles. And a problem that a lot of people have when it comes to performing good pull-ups is improper muscle recruitment. So they don't have the ability to target their lats and really get their lats to do most of the work. And another way to think about this is you see people that can flex their pecs individually, like Terry Crews. I think everyone's seen those memes, right? Where Terry Crews is flexing his pec muscles, doing the sort of dance thing. And that's having an excellent mind-muscle connection. I mean, I don't have that good of mind-muscle connection with my pecs. So that's the idea that we're working with. Now, in terms of piano playing, what does that look like? Well, when we play the piano, we have a lot of different joints here. We have our wrist joint, we have our elbow, and we have our shoulder. We have, all these joints in our hand and our fingers and everything, okay? So all these joints have to be stabilized, because otherwise, if they're floppy, that doesn't work to play the piano. And so oftentimes what happens is they'll all be tensed and held in a stiff position all at once. And a lot of times, we don't have the proper mind-muscle connection to say, okay, relax my wrist, okay? And can I only basically use just enough of my wrist flexors to keep my wrist from collapsing, but can I let go of that? Can that position of my wrist change? One of my recent videos, I talked about how, the wider the interval, the flatter the hand will become, right? You can't really curve your fingers when you're playing really wide intervals, and the higher the wrist goes. Well, if you think about that, what does that imply? That implies that when you're playing, the wrist always has sort of like this dynamic position. It never, ever stays the same. It's always adjusting. So for instance, here's a C major scale and here's my wrist position. Now here's an E major scale. Here's my wrist position. See, it's a little bit higher. It's a little bit higher, and that's because, well, I'm mainly playing on these black keys and they're a little bit taller. So my wrist position is different. Here's my wrist position for an arpeggio. Okay, so see how it's a little bit higher, okay? So we can't really do that when we play if we don't have a proper mind-muscle connection. And, probably most of the students that I've taught, if I say, okay, can you just play a note and can you relax your wrist? Can you move your wrist up and down while keeping that note down? That is a very, very difficult task, okay? So a lot of times I will give, any new students that I get, I'll give them a series of different exercises. For instance, I'll give them an exercise, I call it the swan's neck exercise, and I've talked about it before, where you can just play a single note and move the wrist like so, okay? Then you can do two notes, down and then up, okay? Like so, right? Or another exercise, can you play a note and can you move your wrist in sort of a circle like this? This is a very common sort of movement pattern, this sort of like circular elliptical shape, okay? We don't always use it in a full circle. Sometimes it's just the bottom part of the circle or just the upper part of the circle, but very, very common. And so what we're doing is we're creating a mind-muscle connection. Now, sometimes if you over-explain it, it becomes too difficult to think about, right? Because there's so many moving parts. But really what these exercises are trying to develop is a mind-muscle connection, so you can move in a certain way, recruiting the right muscles, not recruiting muscles you don't need. Because usually this is, you know, like so unbelievably awkward, and people are like, trying to do this, like just make a little circle shape with your arm and wrist, right? While holding a key down. It's the most unbelievably awkward thing. Okay, close the keyboard lid and just do that, you know, on the lid, and okay, they can do that just fine. Now play a key. They can't. It's very difficult. And the reason for that is because when they're playing the key, they're using like all of the muscles to do it, right? To just stabilize the joints and just keep everything down in that position, right? Like this. So everything's tight and tense all the time. Well, it's no wonder that so many people struggle to make progress in their playing or have a lot of tension, because they don't have the ability to use this muscle but not this muscle. Like another example of that would be, you know, this center part of my hand like this. A lot of times when people play, their hand looks like this. It's just very, very flat. Sometimes the fingers are actually, like these knuckles are taller than this knuckle. That's very, very bad. It's a problem, right? It means there's a lot of tension in the hand. And I say, okay, can you just bring up your knuckles like that? That's like an impossible task, right? So I'll give them this exercise called the swamp monster. So here's the swamp monster poking its eyeballs above the surface of the swamp, right? So you're basically just activating this middle part of the hand to develop that awareness of, okay, see that? And again, this is another thing that one student in particular is really struggling with kind of feeling this and getting it, is that it's like, okay, now can you keep that position but bring your wrist up? See how this doesn't really change. As soon as they bring their wrist up, that comes down, right? And really the issue here is that mind-muscle connection, okay? Because again, when we're playing, the wrist is always constantly changing position. It's never going to be in the same position. So if I start here, my wrist, say my wrist goes up, because I'm playing an octave, right? Like I mentioned, even just the idea, you know, that's a little bit, you know, of a better sort of demonstration in that little tiny, tiny fragment there. But if the wider the interval, the higher the wrist needs to be, because the flatter the hand is, that implies that the wrist is constantly changing position like that. But if when you just play a note, if all of these muscles are all firing all at once to try to, you know, keep things upright and keep that key down and all this kind of stuff, then there's no possible way that you can do that, okay? So a lot of these exercises are meant to develop relaxation, but relaxation only does so much, and relaxation is too broad. When I'm playing, it's not really that my wrist is relaxed in that sense. It's that I'm only using the muscles that I need, and I'm not using muscles that I don't need. And those muscles are not doing more than is required. So for instance, you know, how much do my wrist flexors need to tense in this position, right? Well, not much, because I'm not putting a tremendous amount of weight or effort into, you know, playing a key, just enough to put it down, right? And so it's very easy for me to, I can play that key and I can move my wrists and I can do this and keep the key down even just with one finger here, right? So I can move all around and it feels fine. You know, I can even play with really flat, bad form here. It's much harder to stabilize these joints. And it doesn't really feel that much different. It feels a little bit harder to just sit there in the sense that it doesn't feel as easy. just natural, right? But it doesn't feel tense at all. It doesn't feel awkward or bad. And that's because, again, having that mind-muscle connection, that I can say, oh, my thumb was starting to stiffen up. Okay, just relax that. Oh, my wrist is starting to stiffen up. Okay, just relax that. Most people don't even have an awareness that this is happening or ways to address it. So this, called the swan's neck exercise, circle exercise, I call this the swamp monster. Another one that I use a lot, called the rotation exercise. So learning to make this sort of motion when we play. Very common movement. It's in scales, it's in arpeggios, it's in octaves, it's in every kind of technique you can imagine. There's a little bit of rotation because it's just such a natural, normal movement. But learning to just play 2 notes and just swing back and forth here. So I'm learning to build a connection of this movement and connect that with a finger stroke and all this kind of stuff. And I think that it's a really important thing. And thinking about it in terms of the mind-muscle connection, rather than just trying to simply develop certain kinds of motion, because it is doing that. Or thinking about building a mind-muscle connection rather than just simply thinking of relaxation. Because the term relaxation is very broad, and it implies a holisticness to it, right? So when you say, oh, I'm relaxing right now, the implication is you're not working, You're not, digging a hole. I don't know, that's kind of a weird example there. You're not working, you're not mowing the lawn, you're relaxing, right? And so it's a very, it implies a holistic presence of non-activity in a sense, right? And so I think that it can be used too much. Whereas if you think of a mind-muscle connection, it's like, okay, again, think about weightlifting. When I do a bicep curl, the moment my bicep is actually too fatigued and I start trying to use my shoulder to get the weight up, I know that I should stop, because now I'm not training my bicep anymore. I'm just using all these other muscles to compensate. And that compensating happens all the time when people play the piano. And so thinking about it more specifically of building a mind-muscle connection, yes, developing a certain amount of relaxation. Yes, developing certain kinds of movement patterns and motions, which are important, we use all the time. Yes, thinking about developing more flexibility or suppleness in that sense. But specifically, what do those things mean? Well, it means I can connect with a certain group of muscles, and I can relax another group, and I can constantly change what that's happening, So for instance, when I play a note, am I just stabilizing my joints? So these muscles in my arm, which control this motion, they're actually pretty relaxed. They're not really doing much, right? This feels good. The moment I start pushing, ooh, now I can feel that. And I can feel that different. So pushing and not pushing. Here, I'm just stabilizing my joints. I'm not pushing at all, okay? Just like if I was pushing a button, right? Just click like that, right? Okay, so I'm just like pushing a button going downward, but I'm not pushing with my individual finger. I'm just supporting that weight, stabilizing those joints, just like that. And now it's like, obviously there's a little bit of tension because my wrist has to be stabilized. If I relax my wrist, if I relax it up like this, and notice that always all of a sudden feels looser, right? But I can feel the difference between pushing or just stabilizing my joints and bearing the weight of my arm through here, delivering it into the key, right? These are critical things that you have to develop at the keyboard. So if you guys would like to see a little bit more information about more specifics with those exercises, again, I've talked about a couple of those exercises in other videos, but if you'd like to see a more broad tutorial or more in-depth tutorial on those specific exercises, let me know in the comments and I'd be happy to show you guys some of that.